When you finally arrive at the point where you know with certainty that a relationship with an avoidant person cannot continue, when you have recognized clearly that their patterns are not going to shift and that they are simply not capable of showing up in the way you need, the way you choose to walk away matters more than most people realize. It matters for your own healing, it matters for how cleanly you are able to move forward. And perhaps more than anything, it matters for the long-term impact your departure will have on them. Because there are two very different ways to end this, and they produce completely different outcomes. The first way is the emotional exit. This is what happens when the accumulated hurt finally overflows and you leave from that place. You tell them every specific way they have failed you. You express the full weight of your pain. You might beg one last time for them to understand what they have done, or you might go the other direction and come at them with anger, laying out their patterns and their failures in detail before ultimately walking away. This kind of ending feels like a release in the moment because you are finally saying everything you have been holding back. You are making them see your pain. You are having the last word about everything that went wrong. And emotionally, there is a short-term relief in that. But here is the problem. The emotional exit actually does the avoidant a quiet favor. It hands them exactly what their defensive system was always looking for. It confirms the story they have been telling themselves about you, that you are too emotional, too invested, too overwhelming. It gives them something concrete to point to as the reason things fell apart. Suddenly the focus shifts from their patterns to your reaction, and their behavior gets buried under the story of how you acted at the end. Your pain becomes the problem. Your emotional display becomes the thing that people remember, and the avoidant gets to walk away from their own accountability because your exit handed them an exit from it. The second way is something entirely different. Call it the strategic exit, the dignified one, the one that plays the long game. This approach does not come from a place of trying to punish them or produce a specific reaction in them. It comes from a place of clarity, from a grounded recognition of your own worth, from a decision made firmly and without drama. This kind of exit centers you and your dignity rather than their failures and your wounds. It creates a clean, final ending that gives them absolutely nothing to work with. No emotional material to dismiss, no reactive behavior to reframe, no ongoing engagement to offer them any relief from the full weight of what they are losing. And while the immediate impact might feel less dramatic than an emotional confrontation, the long game version is exponentially more powerful over time. The avoidant may not feel the complete force of a strategic exit in the first days, or even the first weeks, but as months pass, as they watch you from a distance continuing your life, as they find that you are entirely and permanently unavailable to them, as they sit with the absence of the closure they wanted and the reconciliation they expected you to eventually allow, the weight of what they lost begins to settle into them in a way that compounds rather than fades. Regret that grows over time is a fundamentally different experience from pain that peaks and then dissipates, and the strategic exit produces the growing kind. Understanding why the strategic exit lands so much harder than the emotional one requires understanding how the avoidance psychology actually operates. The avoidant goes into every relationship ending with an unconscious expectation. They expect you to be hurt. They expect you to show it. They expect tears or anger or some form of emotional display that confirms the internal narrative they have been carrying throughout the relationship, the narrative that says you were too much, too needy, too invested. Your emotional reaction is, in a strange way, comforting to them because it fits the story they have already written. It gives their defensive system something to latch onto and use. When you leave calmly, when there is no dramatic confrontation, no crying, no accusations, no desperate final attempt to make them understand what they have lost, you completely disrupt that expectation. You take away the very thing they needed to feel justified in how they behaved. You force them to sit with the reality that the problem was their behavior and their patterns, because there is no emotional reaction from you to redirect attention toward. Your calm is not just dignity for its own sake. It is a direct refusal to hand them the narrative they were counting on. Beyond denying them that narrative, the strategic exit does something else they did not see coming. It completely reframes the power dynamic they thought they understood. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant almost certainly believed they held the more dominant position. They were the less invested one. They were the one who could disconnect more easily. They likely read your emotional availability and your investment as forms of weakness, as evidence that they held the greater leverage. Your consistent care probably confirmed to them that they could pull back and you would still be there. When you exit calmly and completely and without looking back, that entire perception collapses. You demonstrate a kind of strength they genuinely did not believe you were capable of. You show them that you are able to choose yourself over the connection, that you have the actual power to walk away without being destroyed by it, that their assessment of the balance of things was wrong from the beginning. Unexpected strength from someone they thought they understood creates a very specific psychological impact. It forces them to go back and recalibrate everything they thought they knew about you and about the dynamic between you. And that recalibration is deeply unsettling in a way that emotional confrontation simply is not. The strategic exit also closes every door that an emotional exit tends to leave cracked open. When you leave while still visibly heartbroken, still clearly in love with them, still affected by them in obvious ways, they know the door is not truly shut. They know that your feelings are still present and active, which means reconciliation remains a real possibility in their mind. When you leave while angry and firing accusations at them, they know they can potentially apologize their way back, explain away enough of it, make enough of the right gestures to soften you. But when you leave with calm finality, when you make your decision clear, and then simply disappear from their life completely, there is nothing for them to appeal to. You are not expressing ongoing love they can lean into. You are not showing anger they can try to soothe. You are just done. And the composure with which you are done communicates something impossible to argue with. That this decision is permanent and not up for renegotiation. There is also the matter of how you will be remembered. And this matters more than people tend to give it credit for. When you exit emotionally, when you leave in tears or in anger or in some combination of both, you create a specific set of memories in the avoidant's mind. Memories of you at your lowest and most disempowered. Those memories make it easier for them to diminish you over time, to focus on how you behaved in your pain rather than on the behavior that caused that pain. It becomes a tool they can use, consciously or not, to protect their ego from the full weight of their responsibility. But when your exit is composed and dignified, the memory they carry is a different one entirely. They remember you clear-eyed and resolved. They remember you strong enough to leave without falling apart. That is a considerably harder image to dismiss. It sits differently in them, and it is more difficult to reduce to something manageable. Beyond protecting how you are remembered in their mind, the strategic exit also protects how you remember yourself. People who exit relationships in emotional explosions, who say things they regret, who beg or accuse or dissolve publicly, often carry shame about how they handled the ending long after the relationship itself has faded. That shame becomes an additional layer of pain on top of everything else, and it complicates the healing process in ways that are genuinely unnecessary. When you exit with dignity, when you handle the ending in a way that reflects your actual worth and your actual strength, you have nothing to be ashamed of when you look back. You can remember how you handled it and feel respect for yourself rather than cringe. That self-respect is not a small thing. It becomes part of the foundation you build the next chapter of your life on. The strategic exit also creates something that the emotional one does not, which is a real divergence in trajectories. When you leave emotionally, you both tend to stay stuck for a while. You are stuck in the pain of what you said and what was said back to you, in the grief of the ending combined with the weight of the dramatic way it happened. And they are stuck in their defensive reactions to your emotional display. Neither of you is moving forward effectively. But the strategic exit frees you to begin moving immediately, because you are not carrying the extra weight of regret about how you handled things. You left cleanly. You made a clear and composed decision, and you followed it with complete separation. Now you can focus on yourself. You can actually begin healing rather than staying emotionally tangled in them and in the way things ended. Meanwhile, they are left alone to process something they did not expect. Your unexpected composure, your complete and permanent withdrawal, the absence of the emotional scene they were prepared for. That processing keeps them occupied and looking backward while you are already turning toward the future. And as time extends, the gap between where you are and where they remain becomes increasingly significant. You are building something real for yourself. They are stuck circling questions they cannot answer. That widening gap is exactly what makes the long game so much more impactful than any immediate confrontation could ever be. There is also the question of mystery, which is something the strategic exit creates naturally, and the emotional exit eliminates. When you leave invisible pain, they have a complete picture. They know how much you cared. They know how deeply they affected you. They understand your emotional state and can use that understanding to feel relatively settled about the ending, even if it was painful. But when you leave composed and completely, questions begin forming in them that they cannot stop returning to. Why were you not more upset? How did you manage to be that calm? Had you already started to move on before the ending happened? Were you ever as invested as they assumed? These questions are psychologically engaging in a way that clear emotional information is not. They cannot fully understand your calmness, and they cannot stop trying to. The mystery you leave behind keeps you occupying space in their mind far longer and far more persistently than visible grief would have. The last thing worth understanding about why the strategic exit is fundamentally more powerful is that it comes from an authentic place. Emotional rejection often carries an undercurrent of wanting to make them hurt, wanting them to feel the pain they caused you, wanting some form of immediate justice for what they put you through. That motivation is understandable, but it is ultimately exhausting to carry, and it tends to backfire because it keeps you emotionally tethered to them. The strategic exit is motivated by something entirely different. It is motivated by choosing yourself, by honoring what you actually deserve, by recognizing that your well-being matters more than the relationship. That motivation is sustainable in a way that the desire to hurt someone back never is. And because it is genuine, because you are actually making an empowered choice for yourself rather than performing strength you do not feel, the exit has an authenticity that holds up under any pressure. Now, understanding the reasoning behind the strategic exit is one thing. Knowing what it actually looks like in practice, in specific situations, and everyday choices is where it becomes real and executable. It begins with the ending conversation itself. When you are ready to end things, what you say should be brief, composed, and final. Something close to this. I have thought about this carefully, and I have decided that I am moving on from this relationship. I wish you well, but this is where I am. That is genuinely enough. You do not need to deliver an itemized accounting of everything they did wrong. You do not need to justify your decision with a detailed breakdown of their patterns or your pain. You do not owe them a lengthy explanation, and providing one actually gives them material to argue with or use to keep the conversation going. The brevity is the point. It communicates that your decision is so settled it does not require defending. State it and end the conversation. Do not continue engaging once you have said what you came to say. What follows the ending conversation is no contact, implemented completely and immediately. Not mostly, no contact with occasional exceptions. Complete separation. You block them across all platforms where blocking is possible. You do not respond to their messages, not to apologies, not to requests for closure, not to declarations of changed behavior. You let mutual friends know, gently but clearly, that you would prefer not to receive updates about them. You remove or put away anything in your immediate environment that keeps them actively present in your daily thoughts. You create total separation, not as a punishment, but as the environment your own healing actually requires to function. They will almost certainly reach out. Avoidants typically do once the reality of the loss begins to register. And when they do, your silence is your only response, not because you are trying to make a point, but because engaging at all reopens everything you closed by leaving. Every message you leave unanswered, every reaching out you do not respond to, is the long game operating exactly as it should. The energy that was going into managing the relationship, into decoding their behavior, into trying to create consistency where none existed, all of that gets redirected toward yourself. You invest in your own healing, your own interests, your own goals, your own life. You spend real time with people who are genuinely present with you. You work on understanding your own attachment patterns and what drew you to someone unavailable in the first place, not with self-blame, but with honest curiosity. Everything that was going outward toward them now comes back to you. You continue living your life in whatever way feels natural. If you are someone who shares things on social media, continue doing so, not as a performance for their benefit, but as a natural expression of a life you are genuinely living. If you are someone who keeps your life more private, that is equally fine. The point is not the visibility for its own sake. The point is that you are actually building a life that feels good to you. If they happen to observe that from wherever they are, that serves the long game, but your thriving is for you. It has to be for you, or it will not be real, and anything that is not real will eventually show. There will be difficult days in the early period of this, days when you want to reach out, days when their apology or their declared transformation sounds genuinely compelling. Days when the discomfort of the separation feels harder to hold than the familiar discomfort of the relationship did. That is normal. It does not mean you are failing or that your resolve is weak. The long game includes being genuinely compassionate with yourself on those days while still holding your boundary. When you feel the urge to break the separation, talk to someone who understands what you are doing and why. Write about it. Sit with the discomfort until it moves through you. Do not act on it. The consistency of maintaining your boundaries even through the hardest moments is precisely what makes everything you have done carry the weight it needs to carry. If circumstances place you in the same space as them, handle it simply. You acknowledge them politely, brief and civil. You do not perform coldness or hostility that would reveal you are still affected. You also do not open warmth or invitation that might suggest any availability. You treat them the way you would treat someone you once knew but have genuinely moved past. Unbothered, at a comfortable distance, entirely uncomplicated. Real indifference, or even just the genuine practice of moving toward it, communicates something no amount of rehearsed lines could. And if they ever come back with an attempt at reconciliation, as avoidants frequently do once the reality of permanent loss becomes undeniable to them, the long game means you do not engage with it regardless of how genuinely moving the attempt is. They might express real regret. They might claim they have been doing real work on themselves. They might say the words that part of you spent a long time wanting to hear. The long game means you do not test whether any of that is true. You do not give them an opportunity to audition for a second chance. You can wish them well in whatever growth they are doing while making it completely clear that the door through which they might re-enter your life is closed permanently. Their growth, if it is real, is genuinely good for them. It simply does not involve you anymore. The ultimate destination of the long game is a place where you are not thinking about them very often, not monitoring them from a distance, not measuring your choices by how they might respond, not organizing any part of your inner world around them. A life that simply has nothing to do with them. This is the actual goal. Not making them feel maximum regret, though that tends to happen naturally as a byproduct, but genuinely freeing yourself. Becoming so thoroughly invested in your own present and your own future that their eventual recognition of what they lost has become entirely irrelevant to you. When you reach that place, you will understand what the long game was actually for, not for them, for you. There is a version of you that slowly comes into focus when you stop centering your emotional world around someone who never fully learned how to meet you where you stood. It does not arrive all at once. It unfolds quietly, in the way your thoughts stop looping around uncertainty, in the way your energy begins to return to yourself instead of being scattered across someone else's inconsistency. At first, there is withdrawal from the old emotional rhythm, the checking, the interpreting, the waiting for signs that never fully stabilized. It feels unfamiliar to exist without constantly translating someone else's behavior into meaning. But over time, something shifts. The silence that once felt heavy starts to feel spacious, not empty, but open. In that space, you begin to notice what was always there beneath the intensity, your own continuity, your own presence, your own ability to feel whole without needing fragmented reassurance to temporarily stabilize you. And this is where the emotional reorganization begins, not through rejection of what you felt, but through reclaiming what you had given away in the process of trying to understand someone else. From a distance, the other person may still exist in memory, but their emotional position in your life begins to change. They are no longer the center of interpretation. They become part of your history rather than your ongoing emotional environment. And that shift is subtle, but irreversible. It changes the way future moments are experienced because they are no longer filtered through absence or anticipation. And in parallel, something else unfolds on the other side. People who were once emotionally significant often continue to carry that significance even when they do not immediately express it. But what they encounter after the distance grows can begin to highlight what was unique about the connection they had with you. Not because everyone else is lesser in a simplistic sense, but because emotional familiarity has a way of revealing contrasts. They start to notice differences in depth, in ease, in emotional resonance, in the way connection either flows or requires effort to maintain. In those comparisons, memory becomes louder than expectation. What was once taken for granted begins to look different in hindsight, not necessarily because everything is suddenly understood, but because absence sharpens perception. It removes the noise of assumption and replaces it with reflection. And reflection often arrives late, sometimes much later than the moment when it could have made a difference. There may come a point where they feel the impulse to reconnect, not always with clarity, but with curiosity, uncertainty, or a desire to test whether what once existed still has any access point, whether something remains open, whether time has preserved what was left unresolved, but by then the emotional landscape may have already changed, not out of punishment or intentional closure, but because growth has its own direction. What once felt emotionally available is no longer structured the same way. The door they remember is no longer positioned in the same emotional space it used to occupy. And when that realization meets them, it is rarely dramatic. It is quiet. It arrives in the form of recognition that access is no longer guaranteed, not because of anger, but because alignment has shifted elsewhere. This is where the weight of emotional consequence becomes most real, not in the moment of loss, but in the moment of irreversibility. When someone finally understands that what they had is no longer configured in a way that allows return to the old version of the connection, they are forced to confront something deeper than regret. They confront the permanence of time moving forward without pause. And in that confrontation, patterns become visible in a way they were not before. The avoidance, the delay, the inconsistency, the moments where presence could have been chosen differently, not as abstract ideas, but as lived consequences that now exist outside of their reach. Meanwhile, for you, the shift is not defined by what they realize or fail to realize. It is defined by what you no longer require in order to feel grounded. The emotional dependence on their clarity begins to dissolve, replaced by a steadier internal reference point. You start to recognize that your emotional reality does not need to be validated through someone else's timing. And that recognition is where freedom begins to take root. Because the most profound change is not in whether someone returns or reflects or regrets. It is in whether you are still structured around waiting for that to define your emotional stability. When that structure dissolves, something more complete begins to form. A sense of self that is no longer built around anticipation, but around presence. A sense of continuity that does not rely on unresolved connection to feel meaningful. And from that place, even memory changes its shape. It becomes less of a pull and more of a past experience that informed your growth. Not something that defines your emotional state, but something that contributed to your understanding of what alignment actually feels like. What remains is not bitterness and not longing, but clarity. A quiet recognition that what could not meet you fully was never meant to determine the limits of your emotional world. And in that clarity, you are no longer waiting at the edge of someone else's realization. You are already living in the version of yourself that no longer needs it. And you will not be watching any of that happen. You will be busy, building the life that was always possible for you, living with the kind of clarity and peace that only becomes available once you stop accepting less than what you actually deserve. That is what the long game produces, not just their regret, your freedom. And that is the thing that matters most.